Honolulu Gulch, Oahu, March 1943. The Army has just opened what will become the largest and longest-used confinement site in the Hawaiian Islands. In the swelter of a deep ravine ringed by guard towers, a small compound of women is separated by walls from men's barracks and POW pens. Official paperwork will list them sparsely, and a generation later, historians will admit how little the daily record preserved about their routines. But the fact of their presence is not in doubt. Honolulu held civilian internees and prisoners of war at the same time, including women and children displaced from the Pacific, making it one of the rare places where U.S. custody of enemy aliens, U.S. citizens, and POWs interlaced behind the same perimeter. 2,800 miles east, a different kind of confinement is taking shape in the Texas brush. The Justice Department has carved more than 200 acres out of farmland to assemble a family internment camp near Crystal City. It is not a war relocation authority camp like Manzanar or Minidoka. It is an immigration and naturalization service facility designed specifically to hold spouses and children, Japanese and Japanese Latin American families, in one fenced grid alongside Germans and Italians. In November 1942, the first internees arrive. In March 1943, the first Japanese women and children stepped through the gate. By the summer of 1944, more than 2,000 people of Japanese ancestry live here, nearly half of them uprooted from Latin America. For women who had braced for the unknown, the sight line is startling. Floodlights every 60 feet, a guard tower on each corner, horseback patrols, and inside the fence, a lattice of classrooms, clinics, canteens, and homes. The design tries to make a prison operate like a small town. Language matters at the outset. In American law and in the historical record, most of the women in U.S. custody were not POWs, but civilian internees, mothers, daughters, grandmothers, students, detained as enemy aliens, many of them seized from their homes in the United States or deported from Peru and other Latin American countries to be used in the wartime exchanges. At Honolulu and a handful of other Army-run sites, civilian compounds sat near or within prisoner of war sections, and documentation confirms that women and children were held alongside POW operations. That proximity, and later memory, often collapsed categories in public storytelling. To keep faith with the record while telling a human story, this film uses the precise terms the sources use and explains where the lines blur. So what exactly did these women see that confounded their expectations? Start with the map. Crystal City is 70 miles as the crow flies from the Mexican border, on sun-struck grasslands where summer temperatures can exceed 100 degrees. Seagoville, outside Dallas, had begun life as a women's federal prison and was converted to hold enemy alien women and children. It would become the way station and sometimes the destination for mothers with infants, pregnant women, and women transiting to Crystal City. To women delivered into custody with only the clothes they were wearing, Texas's expanse and heat, the long trains, and the abrupt silence of censorship were a shock in their own right, an environment almost designed to contradict whatever they had imagined the United States to look and feel like. The second shock was administrative, the sheer, humming, bureaucratic machinery of the camps. The Immigration and Naturalization Service subdivided Crystal City into divisions that sounded like a small municipal government: maintenance for utilities, surveillance for access control, education for schools and adult classes, a supply division that issued camp money and ration points, and work rosters that paid 10 cents an hour for laundry, carpentry, shoe repair, ice delivery, and hospital aid duties. The fences and guard towers made captivity unmistakable, but inside those boundaries, the day-to-day life of women quickly became a grind of decisions, responsibilities, and labor that looked strangely like normalcy in the wrong place. Keeping infants healthy in heat, scheduling laundry in communal facilities, sewing clothes under INS-approved projects when wartime shortages made store-bought garments scarce, learning how to navigate a bilingual school day for children who were expected to master both Japanese and Texas curricula. The government issued lists, down to curtains and partitions, for families as small as 2 and as large as 10. The camp built, repaired, and repurposed. Cement and pine frame housing for triplex apartments, bathhouses, clinics, classrooms, canteen counters, recreation fields, even a pool, the INS bragged, could hold 1.25 million gallons. The pool is emblematic. On film reels, the government commissioned to showcase humane treatment. Women and their children splash and play inside a rectangle of water in South Texas, as if to demonstrate that the United States could be both jailer and caretaker. Women's letters and later testimony complicate that image. The pool did not erase isolation, male censorship, or the constant reminders of who held the keys, but it did become part of the cognitive collision many detainees felt. Oppressive custody folding into daily routines that had recognizably civilian rhythms. Oral histories let us hear the arrival as women experienced it. Yai Ihara was transported east for a planned exchange, then rejected for the Gripsholm sailing and redirected to Crystal City. The first landmark she remembered was not a guard tower, but a statue of Popeye, Zavala County's public claim as the spinach capital of the world. She recalled being moved into a triplex with 2 other families and being issued clean clothing on day 1 after days of rail travel without a shower. The memory is striking for what it blends: bewilderment, exhaustion, and the pragmatic routines of a compound engineered to process families by the hundreds. For Japanese Latin American women like Atsumi Ozawa and Elsa Kudo, the shock began even earlier. Arrests in Peru hurried goodbyes. Children shepherded on trains to the port at Callao, then onto U.S. ships bound north. They arrived in Texas to a fenced universe divided by language and nationality lines, a place where the INS openly treated Crystal City as a hostage pool for exchanges, while also creating a self-contained town of work crews, schools, and kitchens. That dual logic, people as bargaining chips and as residents of a managed municipality, defined the next months and years for the women who had to make houses, meals, and childhoods inside it. Segoville's story adds texture to what women couldn't believe. It had been a minimum security federal prison for women. The Justice Department turned it into an internment facility in 1942, and over time, it became a predominantly women's camp that also held children with their mothers. Descriptions from the period emphasize brick dormitories with shared kitchens outfitted with refrigerators, gas stoves, and dishwashers, as well as a hospital and recreation hall. None of that eliminated anguish. Births and miscarriages happened inside the fence. Mothers were separated from older children for long stretches. And as the population grew, hastily erected wooden huts and hot Quonset structures had to be hosed down in summer heat. For women who entered expecting only a bare stockade, Segoville's institutional domesticity, china and table linens in a prison origin complex, was jarringly at odds with preconceptions. Honolulu's counterpoint shows how Hawaii was different and why the word shock fits there too. Hawaii was under martial law for 35 months, the longest stretch in U.S. history. The territory did not enact mass removal as on the mainland. Instead, the Army selectively interned community leaders and others it labeled suspect, then opened Honolulu in March 1943 to hold internees and POWs for longer stints. The camp's geography, a deep, heat-trapping gulch, earned the nickname Jigoku Dani, Hell Valley. Documentation confirms at least 10 women held there, 8 of them Japanese. They were walled off in a single building separate from the men. Source scarcity makes details of their daily lives harder to recover than at Texas camps, but the structure of custody is clear. A women's enclosure operating alongside POW compounds within an Army facility that at peak could hold 4,000 POWs and about 400 civilian internees. For women moved there from Oahu neighborhoods, the shock was less about amenities and more about disappearance, vanishing into a gulch most islanders never saw. Across all 3 sites, The government's attempt to display order is visible in mundane lists and schedules. Women encountered on day one. Work rosters paid pennies, but they created a hierarchy of tasks that women learned to navigate. A rotation at the clinic, hours in the sewing project that produced tens of thousands of garments, shifts in laundry and canteen, and the endless unpaid labor of keeping infants fed and healthy in the South Texas heat, or in Honolulu's swelter. Education offices set up multiple school systems, American, German, Japanese, so that children could study within cultural lanes, and in some cases, because exchange policy contemplated sending families to Japan or Germany mid-war. Women made real decisions in that structure. Which language to emphasize, whether to sign up for English classes themselves, how to weigh the possibility of repatriation against the hope of remaining in the United States after the war. These concrete, often bureaucratic sights and choices collided with what many women had been told to expect about America. Tokyo's wartime media had alternated between depicting the U.S. as weak and decadent or as a brutal juggernaut bent on annihilating Japanese families. What women encountered in Texas and Hawaii was harsher and more contradictory than either caricature. Armed fences and surveillance, yes, but also schools, clinics, gardens, and leaders who tracked milk deliveries and children's attendance. A pool publicized as child-friendly inside a place where mothers negotiated censored mail and the ever-present threat of repatriation. The surprise was not kindness. Women did not mistake confinement for charity, but complexity. America presented itself as a nation of procedures that tried to rationalize even an injustice. The cognitive leap for many, recorded in later interviews, was from ideological image to administrative reality. Because this is a film about what women saw, we keep following images. In Crystal City, floodlights clicked on at dusk, throwing long shadows past the swimming pool's chain link, and across vegetable plots women had coaxed into life along barracks walls. Leafy greens, peppers, tomatoes, eggplants. The INS noticed and wrote, with a mix of condescension and admiration, that the Japanese are excellent gardeners. The same memos assigned Germans to tractor work, like American farmers. Those lines reveal as much about the state's gaze as they do about camp life, an officialdom that sorted people by national stereotype while depending on women's labor to make a family camp run. Voices from the period sharpen the outlines. Yae Aihara's memory of clean clothes in a triplex on arrival is granular, an immediate, practical response to human need inside a rigid system. Another woman, Elsa Kudo, remembered her mother's ordeal shepherding children to reunite with their father in Peru and then onward to the United States. A reminder that for many Japanese Latin American families, the shock of America began before the gate, in the knowledge that their bodies were being moved as pieces on a diplomatic chessboard. Women like Atsumi Ozawa would later recount decisions to pivot toward English study in Texas, an active agency carried out within a geometry of detention lines and exchange lists they did not control. Meanwhile, in Hawaii, the record steps back. We know the number, at least 10 women, and the layout. A single building walled off from men in a camp internees called Hell Valley. We know the timeline. March 1943 opening. Army administration under martial law. A hybrid site that funneled POWs from multiple theaters while holding local civilians labeled suspect. We do not yet have as many women's first-person pages from Honolulu as we do from Texas. That scarcity becomes part of the film's work, to show how archives and memory can be lopsided and how careful a storyteller must be with words like POW women, when the surviving documents say women in a POW camp. By the end of 1945, Crystal City is the largest U.S. internment camp still operating. President Truman's September proclamation authorizes removal from the Western Hemisphere of enemy aliens who had no admission under U.S. immigration laws, and many women face forced repatriation to countries they barely knew or to a devastated Japan. Attorney Wayne Collins's legal campaign keeps some Japanese Latin American families from deportation and secures parole to work at Seabrook Farms in New Jersey. These endgame choices, go back under duress, or start over in a place that had imprisoned you, will shape women's recollections of what America showed them. For some, it will be a ledger of harms. For others, a ledger with two columns: the fence and the school book, the guard tower and the clinic, the order and the loss. What, then, is the cleanest way to hold to the truth and set up the rest of the film? We anchor on three proven statements. First, the U.S. built a system that confined women and children of Japanese ancestry in DOJ and Army sites, including mixed complexes like Honolulu that also house POWs. Second, within those fences, administrators intentionally created domestic infrastructures, kitchens, classrooms, sewing rooms, even a pool, that women had to run, endure, and interpret. Third, the encounter with that contradictory America, punitive and procedural, exclusionary and municipal, forced a reckoning with propaganda on all sides. Some women began to revise what they believed about America, not because guards made speeches, but because daily life in captivity did not match the picture they had been given. That is the quiet pivot we trace from this point on. Belief changing not in an instant, but over breakfast lines, school bells, clinic visits, and the strange blue rectangle of a South Texas swimming pool. September 1943. The train doors slid open under the Texas sun, and the women stepped out clutching their children, their faces still pale from days of travel. The air struck like a furnace. Dust hung in the heat. Guard towers loomed above them. They had heard America described in Tokyo as decadent, as dangerous, as ruthless. But what met their eyes was different. Not cruelty, not chaos, but order. Rows of barracks stretched out like a grid, fences humming with floodlights, patrols passing by on horseback. The sight was disorienting, harsh confinement, and tidy routine fused into one. For mothers with infants, the first hours were overwhelming. They were marched to medical checks, weighed, documented, and told where to live. Each family received a slip of paper with a barracks number. In Crystal City, that often meant a triplex apartment. 3 families side by side, thin walls separating lives that had once been private. Beds were iron cots, each with a single blanket. Kitchens were shared, and laundry lists were already posted. The women realized quickly that survival here would depend on cooperation. Neighbors became roommates. Privacy evaporated. At Segoville, near Dallas, the first impression was stranger still. Brick dormitories stood where many had expected bare wooden shacks. Inside were communal kitchens with stoves and refrigerators. To women who had braced for deprivation, the facilities looked like contradictions. Yet the shock was not comfort. It was control. Every stove, every sink, every hallway was locked inside a fence topped with wire. The familiar trappings of domestic life were there. But they belonged to a world turned inside out. For children, the arrival meant uniforms and chalkboards. Within days, classes began. The women watched their sons and daughters march off to schools that taught math in English and Japanese, history from American textbooks, and penmanship in 2 alphabets. Some children thrived, others wept, confused by the split identities pressed upon them. Mothers faced a choice: encourage English for a possible future in America, or keep Japanese strong in case of repatriation. Either way, the decision was heavy. Every lesson carried the weight of an uncertain destiny. Food lines revealed the next collision of expectations. Propaganda in Japan had warned of starvation and cruelty. Instead, women found cafeteria trays of bread, potatoes, beans, and sometimes fruit. For many, the abundance was shocking. But the meals were foreign, bland compared to rice and miso. Children wrinkled their noses at canned vegetables. Mothers bartered recipes, trying to turn surplus beans into something familiar. A few began tending gardens outside their barracks, coaxing tomatoes and cucumbers from the Texas soil. It was a quiet act of reclamation, a reminder that they still had skills to nourish their families on their own terms. The daily schedule was strict. Bells rang at dawn, inspections followed, laundry lists, clinic visits, school roll calls, everything ran on time. To the women, it felt less like a prison and more like a machine. The United States had turned captivity into a system, precise and bureaucratic. What shocked them was not brutality, but the relentlessness of order. Even leisure was regimented. Swimming hours at the camp pool were posted on a board. Sewing projects were scheduled and monitored. A woman could spend hours stitching clothes, only to see them cataloged and handed back as government-issued property. One of the women, recalling those days years later, said that the strangest moment came not from guards or fences, but from silence. Letters home were censored. Radios were banned. News trickled in through rumors and fragments. She remembered walking the perimeter with her child one night and realizing how quiet it was. No sirens, no bombs, no blackouts. For a woman raised in wartime Japan, the absence of fear was itself unsettling. She wrote in her diary, "Here, even captivity is safer than freedom there." Illness struck often. The Texas heat bred rashes, and crowded barracks meant colds swept through entire families in days. Yet clinics were staffed with doctors and nurses. Women lined up with their children and watched as American medics handed out vitamins and medicine. They could not believe it. In Tokyo, medicine was scarce and rationed. Here, in confinement, their children received better treatment than many civilians back home. The contradiction gnawed at them. America, the enemy, was healing their children. America, the jailer, was keeping them alive. At Honolulu, the experience was different, but no less surreal. Women were isolated in a single building at the bottom of the gulch. The air was stifling, and the sun barely reached the ground until midday. Yet even here, the Army installed showers, mess facilities, and issued regulated supplies. For the women, it felt like being buried alive in a system that would neither abuse nor release them. One called it a valley of waiting. Everywhere, the women faced the same paradox. America had locked them behind wire, and yet America had also given them schools, medicine, food, and even small comforts like sewing rooms and swimming pools. The shock was not kindness, but contradiction. They realized that propaganda had been wrong in one sense. The Americans were not starving them, not beating them, not murdering their children. But propaganda had been right in another. They were completely under American control. That first week in camp defined the years to come. Women learned how to barter, how to cook with foreign ingredients, how to smuggle notes past censors, how to hold on to dignity in dormitories filled with strangers. Some whispered prayers at night. Others wrote journals that would become testimonies decades later. Each act of adaptation was also an act of survival. And every day, as they looked at the fences and the watchtowers, they reminded themselves. The war outside still raged, but inside these camps, they were learning a new unsettling truth about America. Autumn 1943. By now, the women had lived weeks inside fences that turned farmland into miniature towns. The shock of arrival was fading, but something new was taking its place, the slow grind of responsibility. In Crystal City, barracks became crowded homes, and the routines of confinement hardened into habits. Women discovered that survival meant more than enduring heat and silence. It meant building new lives from fragments, and in that task, they carried the heaviest load. The first burden was separation. Husbands were often housed in different blocks, sometimes even in different camps, depending on their enemy-alien classification. Wives found themselves raising children alone, rationing food, and making decisions that had once been shared. One mother described how she tucked her son into bed at night while staring at an empty cot across the room. "War took my husband," she wrote, "but the fence took him twice." For many women, absence was the loudest voice in the barracks. Yet in that absence, leadership emerged. Women began organizing the rhythms of camp life. They created childcare schedules, rotating supervision so that mothers could work or rest. They established sewing circles that doubled as support groups, where needles stitched fabric and voices stitched morale. They lobbied camp officials for more milk for infants, for mosquito nets against swarms, for better lighting in classrooms. Every petition was an act of agency, a refusal to be passive in the face of bureaucracy. In Segoville, where brick dormitories mimicked institutions rather than stockades, women took charge of kitchens. They adapted American appliances to Japanese recipes, teaching each other how to steam rice without traditional pots, or how to ferment pickles in hot Texas rooms. The camp issued ration points, and women traded them like currency. Coffee for sugar, flour for beans. Each trade carried echoes of markets back home, recreated under the watch of guards. In making these small economies work, women built a semblance of community. Health became another domain of female resilience. Clinics staffed by American doctors provided medicine, but much of the day-to-day care fell to women. Mothers boiled cloth for bandages, mixed home remedies for coughs, and stayed awake through nights of fever. Pregnancies brought both joy and fear. Babies were born in captivity, delivered in camp hospitals or in barracks turned into makeshift maternity wards. One woman later said that when she first held her newborn, she looked not at the child's face but at the fence outside the window. His first sight of the world, she recalled, was wire. Religion offered comfort, and women made it their task to keep faith alive. In Crystal City, they organized Buddhist services in one barracks, while Catholic women set up makeshift altars in another. Hymns and chants carried through the camp, softening the hum of generators and the bark of patrol dogs. Faith communities crossed national lines, sometimes drawing in German or Italian mothers. The sound of prayer reminded them that even in captivity, spirit could not be fenced. Education became a frontier of control and opportunity. Women worked as teachers and tutors, determined that their children would not lose years to the war. They argued with administrators over curriculum, insisting that Japanese language and culture be preserved alongside the American lessons. In classrooms where chalk dust hung in the air, children practiced multiplication tables in English 1 hour and recited kanji the next. Mothers watched with pride and worry. Would these children return to Japan as strangers, or grow up in America with fractured identities? The question hung heavy over every page of homework. At Honolulu, the women's compound was smaller, but even there, the pattern repeated. Isolated in their gulch, the women created routines of cooking, cleaning, and caring for one another. Oral memories describe how they kept gardens in the thin soil, coaxing beans and squash from plots no bigger than a blanket. Each harvest was symbolic, life pushing against confinement. They turned scarcity into ritual, proof that control could be met with creativity. The women also became keepers of dignity. They mended clothes until fabric thinned to threads, scrubbed barracks until wood shone, and braided children's hair each morning before school. These acts were more than chores. They were statements. Captivity would not erase identity. Even as propaganda painted them as defeated, the women used routine to remind themselves and their families of who they were. One story captures the paradox. A woman named Haru wrote in her diary about the day she received camp-issued curtains for her barracks window. At first she laughed. What use were curtains when guards could look in at any time? But then she hung them anyway. "If I cannot close the fence," she wrote, "I can close this cloth." It was a fragile barrier, yet it gave her a sense of control. That small gesture became a metaphor for many women. Confinement could be absolute, but meaning could still be chosen. By late 1944, the roles women had carved out were undeniable. They were not passive figures in the story of captivity. They were builders, teachers, nurses, petitioners, and keepers of faith. They carried the weight of two worlds, holding families together inside the fence while imagining futures beyond it. The shock had shifted. No longer the astonishment of arrival, It had become the deeper shock of endurance, discovering how much could be demanded of them and how much they could endure. Winter, 1944. Letters from Japan had warned these women that America was a land of chaos, where civilians starved and soldiers preyed on the weak. The state's radio voices painted the enemy as both decadent and cruel. But inside the wire, daily life kept delivering contradictions. The women saw abundance and scarcity tangled together, harsh custody alongside structured comfort. Every sight was a challenge to what they had believed. Food remained the sharpest contrast. In wartime Japan, rice was rationed, vegetables were scarce, and meat was almost unheard of. Here, in confinement, women stood in cafeteria lines and watched trays filled with bread, potatoes, canned beef, even fruit. The food was plain, sometimes tasteless, but plentiful. Children complained of beans, but never went hungry. One woman wrote that her son gained weight in camp, something she had thought impossible during war. The fence said prisoner, but the meals said provider. Medicine struck the same nerve. In Tokyo, doctors had been scarce and supplies scarcer. Hospitals were overwhelmed, wounds untreated, diseases left to run their course. Inside the camp, women saw American medics vaccinate children, hand out vitamins, and treat infections with a speed that startled them. The very nation they had been told would destroy them was now keeping their families alive. A mother later recalled her astonishment when her child received a bottle of cough syrup within an hour of falling sick. In Japan, she said, we would have prayed and waited. Technology added another layer of disbelief. Radios crackled in guard towers. Electric lights burned all night. Refrigerators hummed in Segoville kitchens. These were machines most of the women had never touched. Propaganda had described America as soft, dependent on gadgets, unready for sacrifice. But what they saw was different. The machines did not weaken discipline. They enforced it. Cold storage kept food from spoiling in the Texas heat. Electric lights ensured that watchmen never lost sight of the perimeter. Even the sewing projects ran on electric machines, turning out clothes faster than women could by hand. The enemy's decadence looked a lot like efficiency. The order of the camps shocked them too. In Japan, military hierarchy ruled with fear. In camp, rules came in the form of schedules, rosters, and forms. Punishments were real: solitary confinement, loss of privileges. But violence was rare. The machinery of control was administrative, not brutal. Women found themselves struggling to reconcile this. They were still prisoners, yet the guards issued water rations on time, inspected living quarters politely, and maintained clinics with regular hours. It was control without the cruelty they had braced for. Education was another revelation. Their children studied American subjects in American classrooms, recited pledges, sang songs in English. At the same time, the camp allowed Japanese language classes to continue. The coexistence baffled many women. Back home, American children would never have been taught Japanese, yet here, their children learned both. A woman later remarked that it was in camp, not in Tokyo, that her daughter first became fluent in English. The thought lingered with her long after. Was the enemy raising her child more broadly than she herself could have? Even recreation undermined expectations. The pool in Crystal City gleamed under the Texas sun, children splashing while guards watched from the corners. It was not freedom. It was scheduled and controlled, but it was play. Propaganda had never prepared them for the image of children laughing under guard towers. One woman said the pool was the most confusing sight of my life. Joy in prison. Faith deepened the paradox. Guards allowed religious gatherings. Women held Buddhist ceremonies, Catholic masses, and Protestant services, often in the same camp. Propaganda had promised blasphemy and oppression, but the women found permission instead. The enemy, it seemed, did not fear their prayers. For some, this was the moment when cracks in belief widened into disbelief. The cumulative effect was profound. each day chipped away at propaganda, not with speeches, but with sights, full food trays, medicine bottles, electric lights, children carrying school books. Mothers realized that America was not starving, not collapsing, not without discipline. It was powerful, organized, and strange in its contradictions. One internee later summed it up in a single line. "We were behind fences, but what we saw was bigger than the fence." By early 1944, the shock of confinement had settled into routine, but each woman's story carried its own weight. The camps were not faceless. They were filled with mothers, daughters, grandmothers, and sisters who tried to stitch lives back together in an impossible place. Their voices, sometimes preserved in diaries or oral testimony, show how propaganda unraveled one life at a time. Take Yai Aihara. She had expected humiliation and cruelty. Instead, she was handed fresh clothes and placed in a triplex with 2 other families. That moment should have been relief. Yet what stayed with her was the strangeness of it all. The guard towers above, the garden plots below, children laughing one moment and weeping the next. She later said that America showed us itself not in words, but in contradictions. The enemy gave her both confinement and clean sheets. Elsa Kudo's mother remembered the journey from Peru. She was arrested with her children, shipped north, and thrust into a camp she had never imagined. In her memory, the hardest part was not the fence, but the uncertainty. Each day she wondered, would they be sent to Japan or kept in America? That question colored everything she saw. When her children received milk and vaccinations, she was grateful. When they studied English in school, she was terrified it meant permanent exile. Her testimony captures the duality. Kindness could still feel like a trap. In Segoville, a young mother named Atsumi Ozawa gave birth behind the fence. She remembered the sterile smell of the clinic, the white coats of American nurses, and the cry of her newborn echoing through the dormitory halls. For her, the shock was not in what was missing, but in what was present. Medicine, clean sheets, trained doctors, luxuries she had not expected in war. She later admitted she did not know whether to feel gratitude or despair. Gratitude, because her baby lived. Despair, because her baby's first cradle was a cell. Other women carried different burdens. One widow in Crystal City cared not only for her own children, but for the orphans of neighbors who had been deported. She became a surrogate mother to 6 children in a single barracks room. To them, she represented stability. To herself, she felt the crushing responsibility of keeping them clothed and fed. Years later, she confessed that the image of handing out slices of bread at night never left her. "That was my war," she said. "Not guns, bread." Faith stories cut through the silence. In one camp, a Catholic nun organized evening prayers for women of all backgrounds. Her chapel was nothing more than a corner of a barracks, a cross nailed to the wall, and a few benches. Yet women of different faiths joined, drawn not by doctrine, but by the need for hope. One internee later wrote that the sound of voices singing hymns in English and Japanese at once was the first time she believed peace might return. Letters home reveal how shock turned into reevaluation. Women described food, schools, and even the pool. Some of these letters were intercepted, censored, or delayed, but those that survived show a consistent theme: disbelief. "We are given milk every morning," one wrote, "even when our children are healthy." Another said, "Our daughters learn English faster than we can. America is not starving. America is full." These letters, when they reached Japan, startled relatives who had been told that the United States was on the verge of collapse. And yet the women also wrote of pain. They described fences that robbed them of freedom, guards who inspected their rooms without warning, the endless uncertainty of whether they would be deported. One diarist described her dreams as filled with wire. "Even in sleep," she wrote, "the fence follows me." Each story shows the same pattern: disbelief, contradiction, and slow transformation. The women had arrived braced for cruelty. Instead, they met order, medicine, education, and a strange mixture of harshness and provision. That was the shock. America was not what Tokyo had promised. It was something harder to define. Not savior, not monster, but a machine that cared while it confined. By the time 1944 gave way to 1945, these stories began to converge. In the shared kitchens, in sewing circles, in the classrooms where mothers taught and children learned, the women were rewriting their own image of America. They did not abandon suspicion, but the disbelief had cracked the wall. They were beginning to see beyond propaganda, not because they were free, but because captivity itself had shown them a different face of the enemy. Spring of 1944 brought more than rations and routines. It brought culture, loud, colorful, and impossible to ignore. For Japanese women who had grown up with silence, hierarchy, and restraint, the camps became windows into an enemy's soul. That was where the true shock often lay, not in the barbed wire, but in the sound of laughter. Music was the first intruder. At Crystal City, the camp loudspeakers carried American swing on Sunday evenings. Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, and Duke Ellington spilled into the barracks. Women who had heard only Marshall drums or koto strings before sat transfixed by clarinets and brass. The rhythms were casual, playful, almost careless. A mother later wrote that her child danced in the dust outside their barracks, clapping her hands to a trumpet's blast. It sounded like freedom, she whispered. Holidays were another revelation. On the 4th of July, the guards handed out small flags to children and organized a baseball game between internees and MPs. The Japanese women watched from the edges, stunned by the ease with which the soldiers laughed, booed, and cheered one another. In Japan, the army was a world apart from the people. Here, the military ate hot dogs in the sun and tossed balls like schoolboys. One internee admitted she could not stop staring. "They were not gods of war," she said. "They were boys." Christmas carried even more weight. Barracks were decorated with tinsel, makeshift trees were erected, and American Red Cross workers handed out toys. Many women confessed confusion. The enemy was celebrating with joy and abundance, while their homeland starved. A few felt bitterness at the sight of children clutching dolls and candy canes. But others felt a different shock, compassion from unexpected hands. One woman described an American nurse slipping an orange into her daughter's palm with a smile. It was the first fruit she had seen in years, the mother recalled. She looked at it as if it were gold. Food itself was a cultural lesson. The cafeteria introduced bread, peanut butter, and powdered milk. At first, women gagged at the strange textures. Bread was too soft, peanut butter too sticky, milk too sweet. But slowly, they adapted. Children in particular embraced the new diet, their laughter at sticky fingers or milk mustaches becoming part of camp life. A grandmother once confessed that she wept when her grandson asked for bread instead of rice. "It was then I knew," she said. His life was becoming American. Language schools added another layer. Mothers sat with daughters practicing English words. Hello, thank you, friend. The guards sometimes helped, exchanging jokes across the wire. For women trained to see Americans as monsters, it was unsettling to find them patient teachers. One recalled a sergeant slowly repeating the word peace, tapping his chest, then pointing skyward. It was strange, she said, to learn peace from a man in uniform. Even leisure carried shock. American soldiers sang while working. They played cards on break, strummed guitars, and whistled tunes. To Japanese women raised in a culture of solemn duty, this casual joy felt alien. How can they laugh during war? One wrote in her diary. Yet the very absurdity of it softened barriers. When the women later compared notes, many admitted they envied the soldiers' freedom to laugh. Small gestures carved deep impressions. A soldier mending a fence paused to let a child pet his dog. A cook sneaked extra sugar into a batch of bread. A guard drew a crude cartoon of Donald Duck and taped it to the mess hall door. Each act was trivial, but together they painted a portrait of America that contradicted Tokyo's warnings of cruelty. And then there was baseball. Few cultural shocks were stronger. On weekends, American soldiers held games inside the camp. Women watched as young men sprinted, slid, and shouted. It was chaotic, noisy, and unmilitary. Yet it became the most popular form of entertainment. Some women began keeping score, asking about rules, even rooting for one side. The sport was not just a game, it was a language of community, a ritual of belonging. By the end of 1944, many Japanese women admitted to themselves what they would not say aloud. America was not starving. America was not collapsing. America was vibrant, noisy, and endlessly abundant. What they saw inside the fence mirrored what they had begun to hear in letters from relatives working on farms or in kitchens. The propaganda was cracking not because of speeches or leaflets, but because of baseball bats, swing records, Christmas trees, and bread. Spring of 1944 brought more than rations and routines. It brought culture, loud, colorful, and impossible to ignore. For Japanese women who had grown up with silence, hierarchy, and restraint, the camps became windows into an enemy's soul. That was where the true shock often lay. Not in the barbed wire, but in the sound of laughter. Music was the first intruder. At Crystal City, the camp loudspeakers carried American swing on Sunday evenings. Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, and Duke Ellington spilled into the barracks. Women who had heard only martial drums or the plaintive notes of koto strings before sat transfixed by clarinets and brass. The rhythms were casual, playful, almost careless. A mother later wrote that her child danced in the dust outside their barracks, clapping her hands to a trumpet's blast. It sounded like freedom, she whispered. Another recalled standing with folded arms, scowling at first until she caught herself tapping her foot in rhythm. It unsettled her. This music belonged to the enemy, yet it stirred something universal. Holidays brought an even sharper contrast. On the 4th of July, the guards handed out small flags to children and organized a baseball game between internees and MPs. Women watched from the edges, stunned by the ease with which the soldiers laughed, booed, and cheered one another. In Japan, the army stood apart from the people, elevated, untouchable. Here, the military ate hot dogs in the sun and tossed balls like schoolboys. One internee admitted she could not stop staring. They were not gods of war, she said. They were boys. That image stayed with her. American soldiers as sons and brothers, not as faceless demons. Christmas carried more weight than any parade of flags. Barracks were decorated with tinsel, makeshift trees were erected, and American Red Cross workers handed out toys wrapped in shiny paper. For many women, the sight was jarring. The enemy was celebrating with joy and abundance, while their homeland starved. A few felt bitterness at the sight of children clutching dolls and candy canes. But others felt a different shock, compassion from unexpected hands. One woman described an American nurse slipping an orange into her daughter's palm with a smile. It was the first fruit she had seen in years, the mother recalled. She looked at it as if it were gold. That orange became a family story, retold for decades after the war. Food itself was a cultural lesson. The cafeteria introduced bread, peanut butter, and powdered milk. At first, women gagged at the strange textures. Bread was too soft, peanut butter too sticky, milk too sweet. But slowly, they adapted. Children in particular embraced the new diet, their laughter at sticky fingers or milk mustaches becoming part of camp life. A grandmother once confessed that she wept when her grandson asked for bread instead of rice. It was then I knew, she said, his life was becoming American. Some women smuggled scraps of rice from the kitchens, trying to cling to old habits, but they could not stop the younger generation from reaching for sandwiches. Language schools added another layer of dissonance. Mothers sat with daughters practicing English words. Hello. Thank you. Friend. The guards sometimes helped, exchanging jokes across the wire. For women trained to see Americans as monsters, it was unsettling to find them patient teachers. One recalled a sergeant slowly repeating the word peace, tapping his chest, then pointing skyward. It was strange, she said, to learn peace from a man in uniform. Lessons that began as survival skills soon became pathways to connection. Even leisure carried shock. American soldiers sang while working. They played cards on breaks, strummed guitars, and whistled tunes. To Japanese women raised in a culture of solemn duty, this casual joy felt alien. "How can they laugh during war?" one wrote in her diary. Yet the very absurdity of it softened barriers. When the women later compared notes, many admitted they envied the soldiers' freedom to laugh. That envy was tinged with fear. What if their children grew to prefer such joy over the discipline of home? Small gestures carved deep impressions. A soldier mending a fence paused to let a child pet his dog. A cook sneaked extra sugar into a batch of bread. A guard drew a crude cartoon of Donald Duck and taped it to the mess hall door. Each act was trivial, but together they painted a portrait of America that contradicted Tokyo's warnings of cruelty. One internee admitted that the hardest thing to bear was not punishment, but kindness. "It broke something in me," she said, "because I could no longer believe what I had been told." And then there was baseball. Few cultural shocks were stronger. On weekends, American soldiers held games inside the camp. Women watched as young men sprinted, slid, and shouted. It was chaotic, noisy, and unmilitary. Yet it became the most popular form of entertainment. Some women began keeping score, asking about rules, even rooting for one side. The sport was not just a game. It was a language of community, a ritual of belonging. Years later, one internee remembered the dust rising from the field, the smack of a bat, the roar of laughter, and realized it was the first time she had smiled since leaving home. By the end of 1944, many Japanese women admitted to themselves what they would not say aloud. America was not starving. America was not collapsing. America was vibrant, noisy, and endlessly abundant. What they saw inside the fence mirrored what they had begun to hear in letters from relatives working on farms or in kitchens. The propaganda was cracking not because of speeches or leaflets, but because of baseball bats, swing records, Christmas trees, and bread. The camp itself became a mirror, reflecting a reality their leaders had hidden from them. Autumn 1944. The desert nights in Texas grew cooler, but inside the Crystal City camp, the air was charged with something else: whispers. For the Japanese women, letters from home were lifelines. Thin envelopes passed through sensors, each word inspected. Yet even with blacked-out lines and vague phrasing, the contrast was clear. Hunger in Japan, fire bombs in Tokyo. And here, bread with butter, music on the radio, and soldiers tossing baseballs in the sun. One woman, Haruko, received a letter from her sister in Yokohama. The words shook her. "We boil weeds for soup. The children cry at night." Haruko's daughter read the line aloud, and the sound clashed with the smell of warm cornbread wafting from the camp cafeteria. Haruko wept silently, torn between guilt and disbelief. How could the enemy feed her better than her own homeland? Guilt was a wound, disbelief the salt. Rumors spread faster than trucks across the camp roads. Women passed them like contraband. Tokyo is burning. The Navy is gone. The Emperor prepares for surrender. They were half-truths, distorted by distance and censorship, but the very existence of such rumors cracked faith. A child asked her mother, "Why does the enemy have oranges when we have none?" The mother had no answer. In silence, propaganda died. At night, the camp loudspeakers sometimes played Roosevelt's speeches. The English was foreign, but the tone was unmistakable, steady, confident, almost fatherly. Women who had heard only militaristic shouts now heard calm assurance. They did not understand every word, but they felt the rhythm. It was not the voice of desperation. It was the voice of victory. The cadence alone told them what Tokyo radio denied. Sound became proof. Letters, when they arrived, carried not only news but scents, ink, dampness, sometimes even the faint odor of mold from bomb-damaged houses. Women held them to their faces, inhaling a homeland dissolving in smoke. One woman whispered, "It smells of ashes." Then she looked out the barracks window where children were chasing each other under floodlights, laughing freely. Two worlds collided. The smell of ruin against the sight of abundance. Truth was in the contrast. Some women became secret chroniclers. They kept diaries, hidden under mattresses, recording the dissonance of daily life. Pages filled with lines like, "We eat bread while they starve, and the soldiers smile when they pass the children." One diary, later published, carried the line, "Every day here teaches me that the war is already lost." For women trained to obey, writing such words was rebellion. Ink became resistance. Others struggled to believe. Propaganda had been drilled too deep. A woman named Yuki told her bunkmates that the bread was a trick, the music a weapon, the smiles an act. But even she faltered one day when a soldier handed her son a Hershey bar. The boy bit into it, his face lighting up, chocolate melting on his lips. Yuki turned away, ashamed of the tears burning her eyes. Sometimes reality overwhelms ideology. Sweetness can break iron. The camp became a theater of contradictions. Guards patrolled with rifles, yet bent down to tie a child's shoe. Barbed wire gleamed under the sun, yet beyond it stood a library with rows of books, even Japanese volumes donated by universities. The women lived inside a paradox, imprisoned by the enemy, yet living more securely than families in their homeland. Each day widened the rift between belief and evidence. A mind cannot hold both forever. Conversations at laundry lines grew sharper. One woman whispered, "If they are devils, why do they share their food?" Another replied, "If our leaders are truthful, why are our children healthier here than in Tokyo?" Such exchanges, quiet as the flapping of wet clothes in desert wind, carried the weight of revolutions. Doubt is contagious. Once planted, it spreads like fire in dry grass. The most shocking revelation came through numbers. Women compared Red Cross bulletins with their own memories. Japan's rice harvest had collapsed. Ships sunk by submarines strangled supply lines. Yet the camp warehouses were stacked with crates, flour, canned meat, medical supplies. One woman described it starkly. "I looked at one American truck and thought, it carries more than a whole village back home." Math became metaphor. A single truck equaled a community's survival. Logistics spoke louder than slogans. Children were the bridge. They absorbed American habits quickly, humming English songs, begging for baseball gloves, even sprinkling sugar on rice. Mothers watched in horror, then in reluctant awe. Their children were healthier, stronger, more cheerful than they would have been in Japan. "I feared the enemy," one woman later wrote, "but I feared more that my child loved his world." In the innocence of play, propaganda dissolved. Childhood is proof of reality. And then came the shock of newspapers. The camp sometimes allowed access to American papers, with headlines about victories in France or the Pacific. Women traced the bold black letters with trembling fingers. The language was foreign, but photographs were undeniable. Burning cities, captured soldiers, smiling GIs handing candy to liberated children. One woman stared at a picture for an hour, whispering, "So this is truth." A photograph can shatter years of lies. Some POW women began to form unlikely friendships. A nurse who had lost her husband in the Pacific still taught sewing classes to her fellow internees, using cloth provided by American relief groups. When American women volunteers visited, they traded tips on recipes and childcare. "We were mothers first," one internee said years later. "War made us enemies. But in the laundry room, we were just women scrubbing clothes." Shared labor builds unexpected bridges. Faith faltered quietly, not with explosions, but with small, daily observations. The sound of a radio broadcast, the taste of fresh bread, the sight of a child clutching a toy. These details became evidence more powerful than slogans. In courtrooms of the mine, propaganda lost case after case. The verdict was inevitable. Reality wins. By winter, many Japanese women no longer believed their homeland's newspapers. They believed their eyes, their ears, and the laughter of their children. They did not say it aloud, but they knew. America was not weak. America was not starving. America was not what Tokyo had claimed. And in that realization lay the most profound shock of captivity. September 1945. The war was over. Yet for the Japanese women held in camps across America, the ending was only the beginning of another story. They packed their belongings, small bundles of clothing, photographs, a toy or two smuggled from the barracks, and prepared to sail home. The journey was heavy with contradiction. They were returning to the homeland they had prayed for, yet leaving behind a place that had shattered their certainties. The sea itself became a metaphor. One shore held their childhood memories, the other their most shocking revelations. On the voyage back, silence dominated the decks. Some women clutched rosaries given by camp chaplains. Others traced kanji characters in the salt on the railing, as if writing their doubts into the wind. They looked back at the American coast disappearing into the mist and felt a pang of confusion. They had been prisoners, yes, but fed, clothed, and shown glimpses of kindness. What awaited them in Japan, they feared, was ruin. Hope felt like contraband. The shock of homecoming was brutal. Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, cities they remembered as bustling were now seas of ash. One woman, Reiko, described stepping off the train and inhaling the acrid scent of burnt timber. The whole neighborhood smelled like a single bonfire, she recalled. Her son, who had grown accustomed to bread and oranges, cried out for rice. But the family had none. The abundance of captivity clashed with the scarcity of freedom. Reality was upside down. Women spoke of reverse culture shock. In the camps, they had seen American soldiers joke with children, share sweets and play games. Back home, they faced neighbors suspicious of their survival, whispering that captivity meant shame. For women raised in a culture of honor, that suspicion was a deeper wound than barbed wire. It was easier to be a prisoner in Texas, one later admitted, than a widow in Tokyo. Shame weighed more than chains. Some tried to describe what they had seen, but words failed. How could they explain swing music under desert skies or Christmas trees glowing in the barracks? How to convey that the enemy had given their children milk while their own government had let them starve? When they spoke, neighbors shook their heads, unwilling to believe. It cannot be, they were told. So many fell silent. Silence became survival. And yet the memories refused to fade. A woman named Michiko later confessed that every time she heard jazz in post-war Japan, she saw not dance halls, but camp loudspeakers. For her, the music was not American entertainment. It was the sound of reality breaking through lies. Another, Aiko, treasured the memory of her daughter's first orange, long after the fruit itself was gone. She planted an orange tree in her garden after the war, a living monument to the day she first doubted propaganda. Memory became a quiet rebellion. Children carried the experience differently. Those who had learned English phrases in camp brought them home, startling teachers with odd accents. One boy, teased for craving peanut butter, grew up to become an interpreter for U.S. occupation forces. A girl who had played baseball behind the barbed wire became one of the first Japanese women to join a local softball league. For them, captivity was not just imprisonment, it was an education. The camp had shaped their futures more than any classroom could. For the mothers, the hardest part was reconciling two truths. Japan had demanded sacrifice, but America had shown humanity. That contradiction cut deep. Some rejected it, clinging to the story of betrayal. Others embraced it quietly, choosing to teach their children that the world was larger, more complex than slogans. In small kitchens rebuilt from rubble, these women passed on recipes that blended rice with bread, miso soup with canned vegetables. Food itself became memory. Decades later, oral histories revealed the weight these women carried. Interviews with survivors captured their hesitant words. "We could not hate them after that," or "I learned that the enemy was also human." Many spoke with tears as if confessing a forbidden truth. One woman described holding her granddaughter's hand at a supermarket in the 1970s. The aisles of abundance, the bread, the fruit, the candy, brought back her first impressions of an American camp kitchen. "It looked the same," she whispered. For her, the supermarket was not commerce. It was memory. Historians sometimes call these moments small reconciliations. They did not change governments, but they changed lives. Women who had once believed America was a land of chaos and cruelty had seen with their own eyes the opposite. That memory lingered, shaping the way they spoke of the war, the way they raised their children, the way they judged truth and lies in later years. A child may inherit property, but it is memory that marks a family. The paradox of captivity endured. In Japan, many spoke only of hunger and firebombs, but these women carried an additional story of bread, of music, of soldiers who smiled. Some never told it aloud, fearing judgment. Others passed it down quietly, as bedtime stories for grandchildren. The barbed wire remained etched in their minds, but so did the laughter of children chasing baseballs inside it. Memory is never singular. It is a double exposure, pain and kindness, loss and revelation, all captured in one frame. Even in their final years, many return to that paradox. Diaries recovered from their trunks reveal the same theme: disbelief. One widow, writing in the 1980s, scrawled, "I still see their faces, young soldiers with chocolate. They were enemies, but they looked like my brothers." Another entry read simply, "Bread, real bread." For her, that crust of bread had become a symbol of all that was true and undeniable. Sometimes history fits into a single word. By the time these stories reached historians, the women were old, their voices fragile. Yet the memories remained vivid, sights, sounds, and smells sharper than any archive. They had lived inside the propaganda machine, and they had seen it collapse. They knew the cost of lies, and they knew the power of evidence. Their testimony was not about statistics or battles. It was about a Hershey bar, a loaf of bread, a child's laughter. The smallest details carried the greatest weight. For the women who lived it, the war never truly ended. It lingered in taste, in sound, in silence. They had entered the camps as believers and left as witnesses. What they saw had shocked them more deeply than bombs or firestorms. It had shown them a truth no slogan could erase: that humanity can appear in the most unexpected places, even in the hands of an enemy. And that truth, once seen, could never be unseen. Winter 1946. The camps were closing. Women who had spent years behind barbed wire stood at the threshold of release. Some returned to Japan, others remained in America under new circumstances, but all carried the same invisible luggage: memories. They were heavier than trunks, sharper than photographs, and more enduring than scars. The barbed wire that had once hemmed them in remained etched in their minds. Yet when they remembered it, they often paired it not with fear, but with strange juxtapositions: bread, music, laughter. For one, the memory of Christmas lights tangled with the gleam of the wire. For another, the smell of peanut butter overpowered the stench of dust. Captivity was not erased by kindness, but it was transformed by it. Kindness inside fences had a force stronger than walls. Women spoke later of the moment they realized propaganda had collapsed. It was not dramatic. It was not when they read a headline or heard a radio broadcast. It was when they saw their children laughing with American guards, sticky with chocolate or smeared with jelly, faces glowing with a joy impossible to fake. A mother once wrote in her diary, "I could not believe the lies anymore, because my daughter's smile was real." Truth wears the face of a child. The metaphor of bread recurred constantly. In Japan, rice was life. In America, bread carried the same weight. To eat soft white bread, to spread it with butter, to see a child savor it. These moments redefined survival. Women repeated the word bread in letters, in diaries, in whispered conversations. Bread was nourishment, but it was also proof. It proved abundance. It proved care. It proved that the enemy fed them better than their homeland. Bread became testimony. Music, too, carved its place in memory. The swing tunes that poured from radios were not merely sounds. They became anchors. Women described themselves as unwilling dancers, their bodies betraying them by tapping to rhythms they had never known. Years later, when swing returned to post-war Japan as popular culture, these women recognized it instantly. For them, the music was not modern entertainment. It was the echo of captivity, the echo of disbelief, the echo of a world larger than they had been told existed. Music became the sound of truth. Even the small details endured. A guard's smile, a nurse's orange, a soldier's broken attempt to say arigato. These fragments outlived entire speeches, outlasted propaganda films, outweighed military slogans. History often remembers battles by numbers, but for these women, history lived in gestures. A Hershey bar could shatter ideology. A square of chocolate was heavier than 1,000 pamphlets. Small things moved mountains. The irony of captivity haunted them. In America, behind fences, they experienced security, food, even glimpses of joy. Back home, their families endured fire, famine, and collapse. Women wrestled with guilt, asking themselves why their children had thrived as prisoners, while others starved in freedom. It was a cruel paradox, and yet it became a seed. Some raised their children with a new creed, judge nations not by slogans, but by how they treat the weakest. Humanity is the truest measure of power. Decades passed. The women aged, their children grew, their grandchildren asked questions. Some told their stories openly, others kept them locked away. Yet when they spoke, the shock always returned. They remembered the disbelief in their own voices the first time they said aloud, "America is not what we were told." That sentence was liberation, more powerful than release from any camp. Liberation begins in the mind. Historians later interviewed them, expecting tales of deprivation. Instead, they heard stories of oranges, baseball games, and bread. At first, the scholars doubted. Could POWs really have experienced such abundance? But the consistency of testimony was undeniable. Different women from different camps repeated the same themes. Abundance where they expected starvation, kindness where they expected cruelty, music where they expected silence. When testimony aligns with memory, disbelief becomes history. The women's stories influenced generations quietly. They did not write policy, but they shaped perception. Children raised on these memories grew up skeptical of propaganda, wary of absolutes, sensitive to small acts of kindness. Some became teachers, others writers, a few even advocates for reconciliation. The ripples spread outward like music echoing across decades. Memory is the longest-lasting weapon. The metaphor of the fence remained. Barbed wire symbolized captivity, yet it also symbolized the boundary between lies and truth. On one side, slogans about American cruelty. On the other, lived reality. Women learned that fences can imprison bodies but not minds. In fact, sometimes the fence itself becomes a lens, forcing one to look closely, to compare, to judge. The wire, sharp and cold, framed the view that changed their lives. Barbed wire can reveal as much as it conceals. One woman, interviewed in the 1980s, said it best, "I was raised to hate, but behind those fences, I learned to see." Her words carried both pain and clarity. Hatred had been easy, seeing had been harder. But once she had seen, she could never unsee. Vision is irreversible. The story of these women does not fit neatly into categories of victim or enemy. They were captives, yes, but also witnesses. They became accidental historians, recording through memory the collapse of an ideology. Their diaries, their letters, their whispered recollections, these became documents as valuable as treaties. History is written not only by victors, but by witnesses. Even in their final years, as their voices weakened, they carried the same refrains. Bread, music, smiles, oranges. These were their monuments, more enduring than stone. A granddaughter once asked her grandmother what America had been like. The old woman paused, then said, "It was confusing. It was frightening. But it was full of bread." In that simple answer lay a universe of contradiction, a universe of revelation. Memory reduces to symbols. Today, when historians retell these stories, the audience often gasps. They expect horror, but hear instead of abundance. They expect cruelty, but hear instead of kindness. That is the shock, even decades later. It reminds us that truth is rarely simple, and propaganda rarely survives contact with reality. Reality always leaves a trace. For the women who lived it, the story closed long ago. But for us, it remains open. Their memories are not just recollections, they are warnings. Warnings about the fragility of truth, about the danger of lies, about the power of small acts to overturn vast systems. History's lessons are often found in the smallest details. A chocolate bar, a piece of bread, a child's laughter in a prison yard. In the end, the shock of those women was not just about America. It was about discovering that the world was larger, more complex, and more human than they had ever been told. That shock changed them. And through their memories, it changes us. Because when bread breaks lies, when music dismantles fear, when laughter echoes through barbed wire, one truth remains: humanity cannot be imprisoned.